Yes.
She has written a fine book about the lost daughter of President Jefferson Davis.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So yes, I was in Des Moines, Iowa for 6 years, where I actually wrote this book, but I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I now live in Roanoke. I moved here almost a year ago. Love Roanoke, wanted to be in the mountains, and just worked out with my husband's job that we could actually do that. So we were very eager to move here. It's a beautiful place. We have loved it. Our kids love it. So it's been a really good fit. But I'm going to talk to you today about my last book. I'm in the middle of working on another book. This was my last book. It's called Winnie Davis, Daughter of the Lost Cause. And being a native Richmonder, I was kind of immersed in that whole growing up in the midst of sort of the remnants of the Civil War, and was a history major, and went on and got a master's, and worked in history museums for many years, Stratford Hall, Minokan Plantation. Also, I'm now on staff at Virginia Historical in Richmond, and they're kind enough to let me do it remotely, which is great. So I really come from a museum kind of curatorial background, but when you work in museums, and I know these ladies in the back, Ashley and Lindsay, know when you work in a museum, you do it all, not just the curator role, not just the development role, not the program role, you do all of it, which is great. And when you write a book, I was kind of used to working with artifacts, archives, writing text for exhibits, and I also did a lot of fundraising, so I know all of the ins and outs, the dirty stories of museum work. And I always kind of gravitate back towards that. I love working with museums, and I think in my books it comes up that I love art and artifacts, and these objects kind of work their way into whatever I talk about. But now let's get on to Winnie and her tragic, romantic, and epic life. I think there's something in this for everyone. If you're a Civil War buff, you'll love it. If you love romantic, doomed romance, then this is for you. And if you just like history in general, I think it's a fascinating way. She was a window for me to figure out what Richmond and Virginia and the South looked like after this devastating Civil War. I had always wondered, growing up in Richmond, kind of living amongst the ruins of that, or what's left of that, I always wondered, what would it have looked like after the war? What would it have felt like? What would you be eating? What would you be wearing? What would your relationship be with Northerners, with these conquerors of the South? So this was a way, it was almost like a window to look into that time period. And I start with this portrait of Winnie. It is a posthumous portrait, and I always say I hope I look that good when I'm dead. She looks wonderful. Death did wonders for her. So, and she was pretty before, but she looks particularly good here. And if you look at that dress, what does that dress make you think about? What kind of a dress does it look like? Right, exactly, like a wedding dress. And that was what it was intended to look like. She was basically the bride of the Confederacy, the bride of the lost cause. So though, as you'll find out, she didn't really even understand Southern history. She was educated mostly in Germany. It was basically European. She becomes this symbol of what we now call, retroactively, historians call the lost cause. I bet a lot of you are familiar with this mythology of the lost cause, what the lost cause is. If you're not, this is something historians come up with later to describe after the war. Confederate veterans start assembling together and having reunions, and they kind of get together to venerate the South and the Confederacy, and to understand and to grapple with the issues post-war of kind of their situation at that point. And some things get romanticized, some things get changed in the course of creating sort of this way of looking at things after the war. And Winnie becomes the daughter of the Confederacy, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that happens later. So we have a wedding dress, we have medals pinned to her bodice. These are medals from the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the Confederate Veterans groups that claim Winnie kind of as their own. Not only are there Confederate Veterans medals, there are also United Daughters of the Confederacy medals. Do we have any UDC members in here? Sometimes I'll come across some of the ladies. They were most helpful when I was writing my book. women after the Civil War are the best fundraisers. They're the ones who raise the money for monuments for the lost cause to honor the dead. It's not the men, you know, they can't raise enough to fund a bake sale. It's all the women are so determined that they are going to keep this history guarded and build it up. So they become big fundraisers and leaders in this lost cause memory or historical memory of the South. So their medals also from the UDC, because Winnie is kind of their figurehead. She is the one, the whole organization is kind of created around Winnie Davis, and she is their symbol. So there's that. Then there is a staff that is to symbolize the Confederacy. It's broken, but it's not torn asunder. You can see it's not completely torn apart, but it's broken. Then you have forget-me-nots, so don't forget the South, don't forget the Confederacy. I also have an art history background. I love art, so I'm always looking for symbols in art. And there's so much here that if you're just looking at it and you don't know, you're not going to understand it. But once you piece it apart, it's a roadmap for sort of the lost cause and how women were treated, how women were thought of, all kinds of interesting things. So I tell the story in my book, in the preface, that as a teenager, my mother would play endless games of bridge at our club in Richmond, and I would be sent in, go get your mother, she's still there. And I would go in and wait for her for a long time. And this portrait was hanging at this club where she played bridge. And one day I said, Mom, who is that lady? And she goes, oh, you don't know about Winnie? Well, let me tell you. And of course, then I found her version was completely wrong, which gave me great pleasure to tell my mother she was totally wrong. This was what really happened. So I had to spend 20 years, you know, doing this, literally reconstructing this, till we finally knew the story. But it was her portrait that really grabbed me as a teenager, and I'm now 46, so obviously it had quite a hold on me. So the happy couple, Jefferson and Winnie Davis. I don't know if anybody knows anything about Davis, the marriage, etc., but it wasn't the happiest of marriages. Does anyone know who Jefferson Davis's first wife was? Yes, and those of you, like my friend Marion, who's read the book, can't say because she knows, I bet, who it was, since you've already read it. Has anybody read the book already? I know my friend Marion has. Other people have. Well, since you've read it, you were exempt from talking because you already know. I would have been really impressive if anyone just knew off the top of their head. Sarah Knox Taylor, who's Zachary Taylor, President Zachary Taylor's daughter, she was married to Jefferson Davis. That was his first wife. Zachary forbid the marriage, did not want them to get married because he liked Davis, but they were both military men. They were together in various wars, and he knew what the life of a military man at the time was, and he did not want her marrying somebody like that. So, of course, they like each other all the more. They're even more attracted to each other. They have this fervent romance, and they do get married. Zachary Taylor does not attend the wedding. There's sort of some bad blood there. And Sarah Knox Taylor dies 3 months after they are married of malaria. So they are barely married long enough for them to have their first fight, and it's all over. So that's the end of the first marriage. And the second marriage, 8 years later, Davis has kind of been a hermit, been on his plantation, reading law, running his plantation. He and his brother, some of the wealthiest men in Mississippi. And his brother Joseph says, it's time for you to have a wife, you need to have children, and introduces him to Winnie Davis. And they are very attracted to each other, but they kind of break up, they have fights. They finally do get married, but it's kind of an ill-fated marriage from the start. And Verena calls Sarah the sainted Sarah, and on her honeymoon gets to go visit Sarah Knox Taylor's grave, which is always fun on your honeymoon, to visit the first wife's grave. So now some of the historians tell me I make too much of that because that was sometimes practiced in those days, but I'm sorry, any woman, you are not going to like this. This is not going to be good. It doesn't bode well for how things go. He's also very much a man of the 19th century, very controlling, very, pretty stern, very opinionated, but he expects the women around him to be submissive, pious, sort of what we would call at the time, or historians now call them, the true woman, the image of the true woman. So you're pious and pure and submissive, and you do what your husband tells you to do. Well, Verena is having none of that. She's highly educated. She is Southern, also from Mississippi, from a prominent family that has sort of gone down in its fortunes, but she's highly educated and opinionated, and she is not going to put up with that. And consequently, they even talk about divorcing at one point, which is unheard of in this time period. They are like oil and water, so the marriage is not good. Despite that, you know, they have a bunch of kids anyway, so they have in total 6 children. And they have one son, Samuel Emery, who they just adore. He dies of measles before the age of 2. So that's the first one. And he's, you know, this is the 19th century. Death is at your elbow constantly. So he dies, unfortunately, of measles, and they're devastated. Then they're not sure they can, if they're going to have any children. It takes a long time to have more, but they do eventually have Margaret, a daughter. She's the oldest. And then we have Jeff Jr., we have Billy, and we have little Joe. So we have 4 children together. They have 4 children. To catch you up on politics, so Verena and Jefferson are a very prominent power couple in Washington in the 1850s. If anybody read Cokie Roberts' book about capital dames, which is an excellent book to check out, Verena and Jefferson are kind of one of these capital dames couples she talks about. And he really could have been president. He was a senator from Mississippi. He became a confidant of Pierce and was Secretary of War under President Pierce. Very close with the family, and then the war comes along. And so, as many of you who are students of the Civil War know, the Southern senators leave D.C., take their entourage and their families with them, and the war is quickly on. And Davis, riding home from this leaving D.C., is called to be the president of the Confederacy, and he accepts, but like Lee and so many others, is very torn, really doesn't want to do it, but feels like it's his duty. You know, and at the time I always tell people, your state was more of your country than the nation, because the nation was still in many cases kind of loose. A lot of it was still frontier. You felt the allegiance more to your state in many cases than your country as a whole. So now it sounds horrible, secession, like treasonous, but at the time it kind of made sense, and Lee and Davis certainly felt that way. So he becomes the president of the Confederacy. The family moves to Richmond, Virginia, my hometown, and they live in a mansion. They move into the executive mansion on Clay Street, which still stands today. They have excellent tours. Would highly recommend it. Little Joe. So if you look at him, he looks like a bunch of trouble to me. I mean, I could look at that kid and I'm like, oh my God, I bet he was hell on wheels for people to manage. So they had nannies and they had staff, and he was kind of petted and spoiled, as all the children were. One day, Verena went down, you know, the war is on, they're in the middle of it, there are bombs bursting everywhere in Richmond, you can hear it, you know, not right in the city, but right outside the city at Drury's Bluff, you can hear all this going on. It's total chaos, there's not enough food, you know, crazy stuff going on. So she goes down to the customs house to take Jefferson Davis his lunch. Leaves the children with their Irish nanny, Catherine, trusting she will take care of them. Catherine, we still to this day are not really sure where she was, but little Joe wanders out with his brother onto this balcony at the White House of the Confederacy. Now this is a present day photo. If you go today, and I bet, how many of you have been to the museum? Oh, a lot. I thought probably many of you had. Wonderful tours. This is what it looks like now. Now when Joe and his brother Jr. wandered out onto the balcony, it looked like this. So do you see a difference anywhere? Yes, thank you. The elevation is much higher. This is about 20 feet up. The balcony now is about 8 feet. So if you fell off now, not a big deal. However, these boys come out of the French windows. Jeff Jr. decides it would be a good idea to balance on the rail, like this. So he's about 11, he makes it across. Little Joe comes out the French window, and as little boys will do, is imitating his brother, does the same thing, falls off, has a horrible fall, his left hip is crushed, there's blood everywhere. Maggie, the daughter, the oldest daughter, flips out, is screaming her head off, and gets a Confederate officer and a friend of his come by. They try to help. The doctors are called quickly. Catherine still, we have no idea where she is. We can't place her. The doctors come, and then one of the staff goes to get Jefferson and Verena, who do rush back in a carriage. They make it there in time to be with him as he dies right in front of them. And one of the Confederate officer, there was a great eyewitness account, and he said, you know, I looked at President Davis, and I just saw the light in his eyes go out right in front of me. And he said, I will never forget that. And that, when I was trying to find a way into the story, as many of you writers will understand, I thought, oh my God, that is the most heartbreaking thing I've ever heard. And it also humanizes Davis. We think of Davis as, you know, this Confederate president who was like not even human to some of us, but he was. He was a wonderful father, adored his children. And this, like Samuel Emery before, just devastated him. He just was inconsolable, paced the floors all night with this little body kind of sitting in the White House of the Confederacy. And I tell you all this because the dynamics of the family are really important when Winnie arrives on the scene. When Joe dies, Verena is 6 months pregnant with Winnie. So Winnie is born into this atmosphere of war, chaos, mourning. The whole city's in mourning for this little boy. All his playmates come to the funeral and throw flowers on his grave. I mean, it's devastating. So this is all playing in the background. So when we talk about Winnie's character, this is really where her character is forged, is in this atmosphere of just tragedy from day one. So the war goes on. We know that the South loses the war, and Jefferson Davis is a refugee. He and his cabinet flee. He sets off Verena and the remaining children. And Winnie has been born at this point, by the way. She's born in June of 1864. Winnie is a babe in arms at this point, and they flee a different route from Davis because they don't want to capture everyone. Davis wants them not to be captured. He's going to try to make it maybe to Cuba, maybe at least to Florida, and get away from the federal troops. This doesn't happen. Verena has a dream. She has lots of prophetic dreams. And this one, I think, would be a pretty good bet, to dream that you're going to get captured. And she dreams it, and indeed it does happen. And the Northern papers make this huge mockery of the whole capture, which I bet some of you are very aware of. And when I lived in Iowa, I was very shocked to go to an exhibit of magazine covers about this, and the Iowa folks thought that this was true. And I was like, no, this is not true. Davis did not escape in petticoats. But that was, you know, a fabrication of the Northern press. And it was, what better way to emasculate the Confederate troops but by showing their leader in petticoats, a bonnet, high-button boots, a parasol. Some of them have parasols. Ridiculous. I mean, Davis would have killed himself before he would have been captured like that. But the myth comes from Verena throwing a raglan cloak over his shoulders, and this was sort of a unisex garment. From that, it was projected out that this was how he was captured, and that Verena stood in, and she did throw herself between the troops and the guns and her husband to try to save him. And if she hadn't done that, they probably would have shot him. But Davis never forgave her for doing that because it made him look like a coward. So interesting dynamic there. And it all plays into the newspapers, and the press has a field day. P.T. Barnum has a show in New York where they reenact this for like months on the stage, and people eat it up, and he makes a fortune. So interesting how the press and the theater kind of play into this. Then finally, we get to Winnie as a little girl. So I doubt many of you have been forced to watch this horrible show called Dance Moms, unless you have granddaughters. Maybe a few of you are familiar with this. It's this horrible show where the mothers dress up their daughters in these awful outfits and kind of parade them around in a dance, sort of a dance competition. And Verena was sort of like a dance mom of the 19th century. She was very proud of Winnie. Winnie was smart, pretty. She could recite Shakespeare when she was about 7 or 8 years old. She and Jefferson Davis spent a lot of time with her and teaching her. They were very proud of her education, so that was a plus. But she always kind of felt like a prized pony. They were always sort of parading her around and dressing her up like a princess. And indeed, in many exhibits, there was an exhibit about her in New Orleans called the Lost Princess of the South, and that's essentially what she was. She was Confederate royalty, along with like Mildred Lee, Robert E. Lee's daughter, and others. These daughters of generals and Davis were venerated and put on pedestals from the time they were little girls. So that's kind of where she is as a little girl. At this point, of course, Davis is he was imprisoned at Fort Monroe for several years, treated very badly, and he becomes kind of the martyr of the Confederacy there. It sort of actually boosts his popularity quite a bit because they were so horrible to him. They never have a trial. He is not, they were talking about doing all kinds of awful things to him. But everyone knows if they try him, it's just going to make him more popular. So they eventually let Davis go. And then the family becomes, they're almost like sort of genteel refugees. They go to Canada, they go to Cuba. They're kind of living off the generosity of friends, and then there is some money that's been stashed away for them in England that they're able to get by Confederate supporters. But it's a very difficult existence from someone who has been the richest man in Mississippi and sort of used to that, and then his family is sort of reduced to near poverty after the war. But they still manage to find these clothes for Winnie and Maggie. They always have great clothes. I have no idea how, but never figured that out. The boys are sent off to Canada to school for a period of time, and Winnie eventually is sent to Germany. A lot of upper class Northerners and Southerners at this time in the 19th century would send their daughters off to basically finishing schools in Paris, in Germany, in England. Maggie, the older daughter, was lucky, and she got to go to Paris for finishing school. But Davis decided the French were too risque, and I love the quote. He said, "They have too many amorous toys," whatever that means. I guess they still do. I love France. I have a master's in French. I think it's awesome, but Davis did not. So he decided poor Winnie was going to go to cold, austere Germany and get her education from the strict Germans in the convent. She was terribly, terribly homesick. She was very close with her parents. She hated it. However, she did extremely well academically. She really flourished there academically, did so well. She had many friends. She was well liked by her peers, and she was sort of became a role model for the other girls. So while she didn't like it, it was very homesick, she did very well. And there she became known, due to this education, as one of the most educated women of her time. So she did benefit from that, but it was kind of a rough time for her. Here's Margaret Davis on her wedding day in 1876. Winnie is back from Germany at this point as a bridesmaid. And I love clothes, so I always have to talk about the clothes. So she had a Worth couture gown. Again, the Davises didn't have money, but they had a lot of style, and they could always figure out where to get things from. This was actually, we think, a borrowed dress from Verina's sister, who was married to an Austrian nobleman. So there are always ways to get these things. So that was Margaret. And then this is the best birthday present I can imagine. Oscar Wilde came to visit Winnie on her birthday, on her 18th birthday, June 27th, 1882. Oscar Wilde was on a lecture tour of the U.S. He was one of the first people to do this. I think maybe Dickens was the first. There may have been a few other people, but he decided, he was at this point not that well known. He was kind of famous for his witty epigrams. So he decided to come to the U.S. and do this tour, and someone said, "Who do you most want to meet in the U.S.?" And he said, "Jefferson Davis." Can you imagine? Like, I can't imagine Oscar Wilde picking Jefferson Davis, or what Jefferson Davis thought of Oscar Wilde, being very masculine, 19th century, controlling kind of guy. He didn't like Wilde at all. Wilde came and had dinner at Beauvoir. He was invited there, and Winnie and Verena loved him, as you can imagine. They thought he was amazing, as he was, and so witty. And Winnie had written a piece about an Irish revolutionary, Robert Emmet, and so I feel sure that, and it was published. She was already starting to publish things. She loved being a writer, was having some things published, and I feel sure she and Oscar talked about that. There are many parallels between the story of Robert Emmet and the story of Jefferson Davis, but martyrs sort of to lost causes. And Wilde loved lost causes, so I think they had a lot to talk about. But Jefferson Davis did not know what to make of Oscar Wilde, so I would love to be a fly on the wall. at that dinner. So she meets Oscar. She's back, you know, with her parents. She's living at Beauvoir, which is on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi and Biloxi. It's a very backwater place at that time. It's boring. It's hot, swampy. There are lots of alligators. There's not much to do. You go into New Orleans for your social life, which the Davises and Winnie did frequently. But you know, she's kind of bored, and she really wants to be a writer. That's kind of the overriding theme in her life of what she really wants to do. So she's working on that. But her other career that is thrust upon her, not the career she wants, is she becomes known as the daughter of the Confederacy. And this happens in a kind of random manner. Remember I told you about the UBC ladies and these monuments, and they're raising money for these monuments throughout the South, which unfortunately people now are trying to tear down a lot of these things, which is a whole other story, wrong, revisionist in my opinion as a historian. But this is the time when they're all being put up. So Winnie and her father are asked to go on a tour and dedicate all these monuments all across the South. So they do this, and Winnie is kind of his secretary companion. Verena has pretty much had it with Davis at this point. It's like, go do your thing, I'm not doing this anymore. So Winnie goes in her stead. And one day they're in Atlanta at a stop, and there are thousands of Confederate veterans screaming, doing the rebel yell. They're playing the Bonnie Blue flag. It's sort of just like the Gone with the Wind dance hall scene is what I always think about. So it's kind of crazy like that. And Davis is sick. Governor Gordon, who some of you may remember, General Gordon, very famous general, he's the governor of Atlanta at this time. And I think of him sort of like P.T. Barnum. He's a real showman. He's up for re-election, so you know he's trying to do everything he can to get that. So he sees Winnie, and he's like, oh my gosh, she's beautiful. It doesn't matter if she's articulate, because we're not going to really let her talk, but I'm going to use her. So he pulls her out onto the back of the train and says, I present to you the daughter of the Confederacy. And the crowd just goes crazy. They're like, this young, beautiful woman, this is Jefferson Davis's daughter, and she is going to carry on the Southern tradition kind of into the future. So it's kind of taking maybe somewhat of a musty, lost cause and making it fresh and new. It's just marketing in its finest, purest form. So she doesn't know what to do, because remember, she's essentially German. Her parents have not allowed her to learn about Southern history. They basically forbid it. So she doesn't even know. She doesn't even though she is learning, she's absorbing all this stuff, but she's a very unlikely symbol because she's really European and highly educated. So she comes into this role where she is really like a doll or like a pageant queen. She's put up on a pedestal, worshipped by these veterans. They all want to shake her hand or meet her, but she isn't really supposed to say anything. She's sort of just a silent symbol. And that's, in my opinion, and other historians' opinions, so that these Confederates can project kind of their views, their fantasies about the South onto this sort of blank, beautiful canvas. That's sort of what happens, what ends up happening. Because if she doesn't speak, she can sort of be a blank screen. And that's kind of what they want. It's kind of strange, but I think a lot of us Southerners kind of get this. Like, it kind of made sense to me. Not condoning or, you know, saying terrible things about it either way. It was just sort of a way of coping, I think. Very interesting psychological sort of phenomenon. So this image, you're going to start seeing, from here, she becomes a Confederate, what I would call the Confederate it girl. She's all over the place, on posters, on postcards. Any Confederate Veterans Medal you see or find, and you can buy these on eBay, will have Winnie's portrait, kind of her silhouette etched on it. She's the symbol of the UBC, the symbol of the Confederate veterans, the symbol of the lost South, and the Northerners all know who she is. She becomes really famous, and then she can't move without people talking about her, and her parents get really worried about how she's going to represent them in the nation. So again, Winnie's image is used without her permission to advertise everything from veterans reunions to Dr. Harder's iron tonic, which I seriously doubt worked and probably had arsenic in it, so that was probably not good. You see it on ice cream, cotton candy, and I love seeing how advertising, even in the 19th century, it's pre-Mad Men and all that stuff, but people are looking for attractive, interesting people to sell things. In this case, they are selling the Confederacy. They're selling a school of thought. They're selling a type of history through her. And also, along the way, Dr. Carter's iron. Why not? Winnie doesn't get paid. She doesn't really care, but she thinks it's all pretty strange. And it is. So this is all moving along nicely. She's representing the family legacy. She's in the press. She's going to balls and teas, which she doesn't really like. She really just wants to write, but she's doing it for her family, to represent them. And then a complication arrives. A 6-foot-tall Harvard graduate named Alfred Wilkinson, who was a classmate of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's. Good-looking, 6 feet tall, super cute, rich. I mean, just the whole package here. Nice, highly educated. And he meets Winnie at a party in Syracuse, New York. And many people are like, why would Winnie be up north? She really prefers the north, as does her mother, Verena, to the south. They don't like the climate. Verena's grandfather, by the way, was the governor of New Jersey. So she has all these northern cousins, northern connections. And New York, many of you probably know, a lot of ex-Confederates went to New York and became continued to be lawyers, doctors, whatever. There was no money in the South. There was no career. Many writers, many writers, there are different ones you might know, but Southern writers go up north and they start working for the newspapers, including Joseph Pulitzer's newspapers, which is what Winnie and Verena eventually do. But they meet at this party, and the lore is that Fred and Winnie instantly are smitten and fall in love. It's just like Romeo and Juliet. They also meet at the party. So you have this sort of, startling connection that they have. And intellectually, they're very well matched, similar educations and families. There are just a few problems, like he's northern, she's southern. She's the daughter of the Confederacy, the daughter of Jefferson Davis, and it turns out his grandfather, Samuel May, is a really famous abolitionist. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine in the South at this time the firestorm that this would have created? To fully understand it, you have to immerse yourself in the newspapers at the time, which I did. And it was like the biggest tabloid thing you have ever seen. It was crazy. It was a huge romance chronicled in the newspapers and speculated upon. In the North, it was received very well because there was this sort of reconciliation movement. This is 20 years after the war. People wanted to reconcile. Believe it or not, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and others were big proponents of the country reconciling, of people coming back together. Move on, get over the war. We got to, move forward as a united country. But many Southerners were still just bitter about the war, and understandably, since their homes had been burned, looted, all kinds of awful things that happen in every war happened in the South. So that's the backdrop against these young people when they're courting, kind of what they're dealing with. So, Romeo of the North and the Juliet of the South. Young, good-looking, ill-fated. And this is the home of Samuel Joseph May, Fred's abolitionist grandfather. What's interesting is underneath this porch, this was a big stop on the Underground Railroad, and Winnie and Fred spent a lot of time courting on the porch, which I just found that deliciously ironic and interesting. So that was kind of cool. So I had to have that photo in the book. And all these photos are in the book, by the way. Enter Joseph and Kate Pulitzer. I'm sure you know about the Pulitzer Prize, correct? Everyone knows about that, journalism prize. Joseph Pulitzer was a newspaper man, or became a newspaper magnate. He was just one of the biggest people, along with William Randolph Hearst, biggest newspaper publishers in the U.S. But he started as a very poor Hungarian immigrant who was basically a mercenary soldier hired by the Union Army in America to come fight in the Civil War, and that's how he got here. But after that, he started working for newspapers, taught himself English, did incredibly well, and he, by chance, marries Kate Davis, a Davis cousin. So they marry, and through Kate Davis, he meets Jefferson Davis, Winnie, Verena, and they become, Kate and Winnie become best friends. And they're sort of like the fairy godparents, because you remember the Davises have no money. They're, almost bankrupt. So they want all these fine things for their daughters. They want debuts and weddings and clothes. And not that the Davises would ever have asked for any of this. They're very proud people, but people wanted to help them, or some people really wanted to help them. And Kate, being a Davis cousin, really wanted to help them. So Joseph Pulitzer, in many ways, is kind of the savior of this family. And he decides, he and Kate have made Winnie as the godmother of one of their sons, and they've spent a lot of time with Winnie. And when this romance comes up, and people know about it, and the newspapers start talking about it, Winnie basically has a nervous breakdown. She doesn't know what to do. And Joseph and Kate decide to whisk her away to Europe for a spa trip to cure her nerves, which I continue to ask my husband for a spa trip to cure my nerves, and he won't let me have it. It makes me so mad. Someday I'm gonna just go on my own somewhere. But anyway, at this time that was very fashionable, very popular, still is actually, but so they whisk her away on this trip hoping that she will decide one way or the other about the romance. And then Fred comes over, and Verena tells him to go over there and make Winnie set a date for this damn wedding. She one day wants them to get married, the next minute doesn't. She's very confusing. So they all are in Europe together, and they are the worst chaperones ever. Kate is having an affair with one of Joseph Pulitzer's colleagues. Joseph Pulitzer is blind, which is an excellent quality in a chaperone. I wish all my chaperones when I was a teenager were blind. It would have been way more fun. I didn't have that luxury, but I mean, they're not watching. They don't care what Winnie and Fred are doing when Fred comes over to visit. Now, because we're in the Victorian age, I think some proprieties were observed, and there have been rumors that Winnie perhaps got pregnant while she was in Europe. And I am here to defend her honor. I don't think that happened just based on her temperament and knowing how nervous she was and how worried about public opinion. I honestly think that is the last thing she would have done. However, these two had every opportunity to do whatever they decided to do. So we will really never know. There's been no evidence of a child or anything like that. I don't think that's true. But I once had the head of the Library of Congress, the Civil War section, tell me he thought that was what had happened, which is in the book. I think he's wrong. Maybe I'm naive. My husband tells me I'm incredibly naive, maybe so. But I don't think that happened, but I do think the situation was very strange. And for Jefferson Davis to allow his daughter to do this, what in the world? And Verena to push it, to want the fiancé to come over there, it was very strange. In the 19th century, ladies didn't go out without a chaperone. These two went all over Europe touring without, at night they had people with them, but in the daytime, no chaperones. Who knows? I'll leave it up to the reader. You can come to your own conclusions. Sadly, despite all this freedom, or maybe because of it, I don't know, they break up. So it is partially because of the outcry of Confederate veterans and others threatening to kill Fred. One of them threatens to shoot him with a mini ball if he comes near Winnie. And the letter's hilarious. It's like, "Dear sir, please do not come near the daughter of the Confederacy, or we'll shoot you with a mini ball. Sincerely, the Robert E. Lee Company." They're very polite. Southerners are very polite when they threaten to kill you. But that kind of made Fred have a little hesitation, I think. But he stuck it out. He loved when he wanted to get married. What really happened was, I think, in my opinion as a historian, we had all this outcry in the press, which made Winnie very nervous. And then Verena had second thoughts. And then she decided Fred wasn't making enough money to support her daughter, which was ridiculous. He was a patent attorney. He was making lots of money. But she and some of her friends, we think Jubal Early, who was not the nicest person, another Confederate general, the watchdog of the Confederacy, he said, "You gotta fix this, Verena. We need to break this up." He just flat out said it. And so there is some evidence that Jubal Early probably sent some people to New York, Syracuse, New York, where Fred lived, to dig up the dirt on him. The dirt is then presented to Verena, which is that his father was an alcoholic, embezzler. There were some bad things going on in the family. And from this, she concludes that Fred will never make money. The real heart of the story, I think, is Verena was also very codependent on Winnie, couldn't give her up. This was her last child. that was still with her. At this point, all 4 of her boys are dead. I've told you about 2. The other ones die of diphtheria and yellow fever. So she's lost all 4 boys. All she has is Winnie. Margaret is married. She's living in Colorado Springs. It might as well have been China because it was so far away. Margaret and Verena were often at odds. So Winnie was her last little chick that was left. And I just think she couldn't give her up. She wanted to give her up. She pushed Fred to go seal the engagement. But then she met with Fred at Beauvoir and basically said, you're done. It's over. So there was a push-pull there. I think Verena just couldn't quite bring herself to let Winnie have her own life. And Winnie was a people pleaser, and she also really, I'm not sure she wanted to get married after watching her parents in their horrible marriage. It's a lot of interesting psychology. But again, the reader, you can read and you can decide. The consolation prize is that Winnie gets to be Queen of Comus in New Orleans. And I was in New Orleans all last week. I went to the Confederate Museum there called Memorial Hall. Has anyone ever been to that? Oh, you've been. It's awesome. It's such a cool place. And I met with the curator, and she pulled out a fragment of this dress, and I just about like flipped out. That's how dorky I am. I was like, oh my God, there it is. It was this silk piece, but it was falling to pieces. It was just shredded, falling apart. It was sad. But I also saw the jewels, the Mardi Gras jewels, a whole case of them. Just like this, you've probably seen them at Memorial Hall. They're in this glass case, and that was really cool. So, to me, that would be pretty awesome to be the Queen of Comus, because they don't let anybody that isn't a New Orleanian become the queen. But in Winnie's case, they did, because her dad was the president of the Confederacy. So she was there, Mildred Lee. They had kind of a year where they did all the Confederate daughters, prominent ones. And Winnie was the queen, and she got to wear this beautiful, beautiful dress and be the center of attention. But you can see she's still got that melancholy look that she has in the portrait. She really doesn't like balls and parties. She likes writing and art, and really is kind of an introvert. So this would appeal to a lot of girls, but it doesn't really do it for Winnie. But she did love New Orleans and spent lots of time there socially. What she really likes to do, as I keep saying, is write. So finally, you remember our terrible blind chaperone, Joseph Pulitzer. He is a terrible chaperone, however, he is their financial savior, Winnie's and Verena's. Jefferson Davis dies in 1889 while Winnie is on this trip to Europe, which gives her something else to feel very guilty about. And Verena and Winnie finally decide they're going to leave Beauvoir. They hate it. They don't want it. There's a whole thing about Beauvoir, where it came from, you can read about in the book. But it was not a place where Verena ever felt at home. So, and they both loved the North. They loved New York. So the ladies moved to New York to become writers, and they do well. They support themselves. But it's because Joseph Pulitzer gives both the ladies a stipend to write articles for him. Verena's actually a terrible writer, so that's just a gift. But Winnie is talented, and her mother knows she has talent, and again, kind of pushes her to write. But this is an area that Winnie agrees. She wants to write. She loves to write. She writes novels that are very well received. She writes for the newspaper, and she's really coming into her own. She's just, a career woman. And I'm frankly not sure she ever really wanted to get married or have children. That was awfully confining. And you could not write. You would not, most husbands would not allow their wives to be published if they were married. That would be scandalous. So, she had to make some choices there. So that is a picture of her in the 1890s, right when all these books are coming out. She's being celebrated as a writer. She's kind of on her way up in the literary world. Again, sadly, this all ends. So this promising kind of literary career, this life in New York amongst like-minded people, artists and writers, comes to a very tragic end. And ironically, it is partially connected with her role as the daughter of the Confederacy. It's actually quite directly connected with that. Verena is always guilting Winnie about, you've got to keep up with your father's old friend. You've got to represent us in the Confederate veterans reunions. And Winnie doesn't want to go, but in 1892, I believe, I'm sorry, 1898, there is a Confederate Veterans Reunion in Atlanta. And she says, "You gotta go, Winnie, you've gotta go represent us." And so Winnie goes, and they have a big parade. You know, it's always all these celebrations, parties, balls, and they have an outdoor parade. And Mrs. Stonewall Jackson, Anna Stonewall Jackson, is in a carriage with Winnie. They're trapped in the carriage, it's pouring rain. They get soaked to the skin, and they're trapped in this carriage for like 2 hours, because you cannot imagine how huge these Confederate Veterans reunions were. They were just thousands of people. So they're trapped in the carriage, they're wet, then they have to rush back to the hotel and get dressed for this very grand ball. So Winnie goes to the ball, she dances all night. And when I was in New Orleans just a couple of days ago, the curator of this Memorial Hall showed me this beautiful red velvet box that had a gold watch in it. And this was what the Confederate veterans presented to Winnie at this particular ball, the last time she would be seen in public. So that was kind of eerie to see that. They present her with that. She gets on the train the next morning and goes to Narragansett, Rhode Island, where she and her mother always summer at these very fancy resorts. Jackie Kennedy later will go to all these resorts. It's a very fancy place. So she gets there, she's desperately ill. They can't figure out what's wrong. She has a fever, stomach upset. She cannot eat. And her mother, though, she rallies. Her mother thinks she's going to be okay, tells everyone it's going to be fine. And then she dies. She's 33 years old. She's quite young. You know, this promising career is over, and you can imagine how devastated her mother is. This is the 5th child that has died before her. Margaret's the only one left.